let's take just a moment to remind ourselves, make clear again the point of what we're doing right now, frame where we are and the trajectory of what we're trying to do right now in this set of talks, or rather in this talk. So we were identifying a group or a list of elements or aspects of the imaginal to try and make more clear what we really mean by that word imaginal, which different people use. And so that to support the understanding and the grasping of the conceptual framework that we're using and employing, and also to kind of deepen, enrich and refine the sensitivity and the discernment in practice when one begins to notice these things, pay attention to them and tune to them, these aspects and elements of the imaginal constellation experience. And in addition to that, we are pointing out the possibility of noticing and tuning to some of these aspects in different ways in order to, if you like, support the movement of, or the development, the evolution of some perception into the more fully imaginal realm, the more authentically imaginal realm. And we said there was a spectrum of the uses of imagination, and kind of at one end is the more what we're calling imaginal. So that these elements can be played with, attended to in a way that amplifies them, ignites that specific node or element aspect that one's paying attention to, and then that in turn can ignite or spread that illumination, that activation, that soul life can spread through the other nodes of the lattice, the other stars of the constellation. So the general point about this kind of amplification or ignition, as we said, we can notice one of these elements or aspects. In here I am working with an image, here I am with a certain perception, and I notice one of these elements. I bring my attention to that, and I kind of sensitively tune into that particular quality. Or I bring a delicate question to bear in relation to that node. So for example, is this imaginal figure autonomous? Do they seem independent? And just the introduction of the question lightly, it shapes my attention in a way that shines a light on that particular element, and the light may, as I said, illuminate, ignite, amplify that element, draw it out to the consciousness, bring it to life, really, and then from there the whole thing may become more imaginal. Or the question, is this imaginal figure, do I have a sense that they're, would I call them real or not real? And so sometimes the questions can be posed in actual language, in time like that. Sometimes that's way too clunky. It's more a kind of question that's very subtly implicit in the very attention itself, in the looking. It's very, very nuanced and delicate. Or another question, another kind of way of bringing a kind of very sensitive, curious attention. Again, say with the example of an imaginal figure or material perception that we're wanting to, again, help it move, evolve along the spectrum towards a fully imaginal, fully sensing the soul. Another question might be, am I loved? Am I loved by this other that I am perceiving? And or what kind of love do they have for me? What's the quality or the character of that love that may be there, that I might sense? So again, this possibly just noticing, possibly a kind of questioning, or a kind of curious, sensitive attention to one of those elements or aspects on the list that we're going through. And thirdly, the possibility that one can actually shift one of those elements, move it, turn it on, switch it on, wiggle it or jiggle it or change it a little bit so that it turns on, and in being turned on, it turns on the other elements, and the whole constellation, the whole lattice is turned on, illuminated, amplified to resonate in that imaginal kind of wavelength of things. And sometimes, so there's those three possibilities: just noticing, just a kind of questioning or sensitive, curious attention, the possibility of actually focusing on one and shifting it, switching it on, turning it on, wiggling, jiggling it until it comes on. Very, very delicate, all this. Very delicate, very light, not so clunky. I've said before, and I'll say it again right now, a lot of the evolution, I think, when we talk about practice going deeper or evolving or maturing, a lot has to do with things becoming more subtle, actually. Not so much more fireworks, more clunkiness, more grossness. A lot has to do, I think, with things, the experiences becoming more subtle, and correspondingly our awareness and our responsiveness and our responses becoming much more sensitive, much more delicate, nuanced and subtle. And sometimes, as a kind of third or fourth possibility, we can actually start with one of these deliberately with one of these elements that may be accessible for us at that time. So, for example, we might just have accessible to us a general sort of humility in relationship with what might even be a very vague sense of divinity. And there's just the sense of my humility in the face of the divine, or the whatever words one wants to use, and then that humility, and despite the vagueness there, again it functions. That node is being illuminated, amplified, brought out more, brought to life more, and that can spread. And the vagueness may remain. We talked about a sense of divinity as one of the other nodes. Well, that may remain vague, or it may get more clear or more particular or whatever. Or another one that one deliberately start with is actually loving. So here, I'll come back to this later as an example. So here's this perception of another, and what if I actually express love? We said that love was one of these nodes, loving and being loved. What if I actually just now, deliberately, I feel the germ, the seed, the basis of that love, it's just a little bit. What if I amplify it? What if I express it? What if I tune into it, switch it on? Then what happens? Or it might be, as another example, it might be for those who have a kind of what I would call a deep understanding of emptiness, and that one that's really accessible in the perception. One can have that understanding in the moment, in the actual perception of things, of the middle way of emptiness, neither real nor not real, and the kind of magic of that. And if you do know that kind of level that I'm talking about, in the way that opens up all kinds of possibilities, as well as the sacredness of things. And then that middle way of emptiness, it's, for some people it's quite easy then, it's fertile ground to open up the middle way of the imaginal, that we'll come back to shortly. And then that can open up the whole realm, the whole tenor, field, and texture and wavelengths of the imaginal. Or it might be that what's accessible right from the beginning in a deliberate way is that fullness of intention, that element that I drew attention to. Can't remember what number it was on our sort of list. The fullness of like, I am here, I am intending in practice, I am in a stance of relating to this figure or this other or this imaginal perception, not primarily for my sake, but for something bigger, for the sake of soul-making, for the sake of the divine, for the sake of the Buddha nature, whatever makes sense to one. That fullness of intention is also going to have a kind of alchemical catalyzing capacity at that point, potentially. Or it may be, and I think I've suggested this, and we've done a little bit on some of the retreats, one can start with a deliberate image of one's energy body, or a deliberate image of one's body. So, for example, just imagining the body as a body of light, and maybe it wants to be a particular color, blue, or it could be anything, and just staying with that imagination, and then tuning. It's a deliberate imagination, but then feeling what that feels like, what the body feels like, with sensitivity, tuning to that particular wavelength of that image and that sense of the energy body, and see what opens up then from this image of the energy body and the sense of it. And it may be that other images open up, or that itself becomes genuine imaginal image, or something starts to interact with that, or it relates to its environment, its immediate environment, in a way that's imaginally, genuinely imaginal, or sensed with soul, etc. I think on one retreat, in fact I remember on one retreat we did a guided meditation with the Om Mani Padme Hum mantra, and conceiving and imagining the syllables as jewels, and the body as made somehow in some mystical way, made of these cosmic, magical jewels of compassion, of the syllables of the Om Mani Padme Hum mantra, or might just be jewels. Yes, again, magical, mystical jewels. What is it to have a body of jewels? Or it might be something kind of at the other end of the jewels can be very hard, can't they? Adamantine. But might be something at the other end of the spectrum, in terms of earthiness and solidity. What is it to imagine the body as a body made of, or at one with, or mixed with, or emerging from the roots of trees underground in the dark, damp, fragrant soil, the moist earth, and actually imagining that, and then again tuning into that and see what comes from that. So different possibilities in terms of how we use these nodes, how we relate to the nodes in terms of the supporting and encouraging that movement into the fully imaginal, and the fully sensing the soul. So we were going through our list, and we got to, I think, number 16. What I was calling number 16, depending on how you count, how you slice it up. That was meaningfulness, and we made the point that specific meanings, specific echoings of the image with life and the life with the image, and the sense of maybe particular kind of duty or particular values. These elements are all kind of, if you like, sub-elements or part of the aspect of meaningfulness. But meaningfulness, that's what the suffix fullness is partly intended to mean. Meaningfulness is something larger than any specific meaning, or even a limited, finite collection of meanings or echoes or whatever, or reduction to values. Meaningfulness is something larger. It's somewhat akin in its kind of largeness and openness to the kind of infinite echoing and mirroring. It's bigger than individual echoes or ways that life and image reflect each other. So meaningfulness is more like, we say, like this image or this perception I have is pregnant with meaningfulness. And so there's something discernible and something half hidden, just like when you see a pregnant woman or animal. The pregnancy is visible, and palpable, but what is being gestated is not yet visible, and it may, of course, in the case of pregnancy, it will come visible. So sometimes things emerge from the imaginal, from the sensing the soul, from a hiddenness into manifestation, but we never exhaust that meaningfulness. The pregnancy, if you like, is never fully over. One is the imaginal is always pregnant. The soul is always pregnant and always giving birth, or at least very often giving birth again and again. So there's something kind of tangible and something obscure. There are the intimations of meaning, and all that is intended by the word meaningfulness. But the obscurity, or the not quite knowing what's there, half hidden, it does not make meaningfulness any less powerful for that. So the fact that we're not entirely clear what it is that so moves us and so has this meaningfulness for us, and it gives us a sense of devotion and orientation, and functions like a beacon for us, touches our heart, touches our soul. The fact that we're not exactly clear what it is, we can't neatly define it, wrap it up, sum it up, does not take away any of the power of that meaningfulness. Quite the contrary. Okay, and then number, I think, 17 on the list, on our loose list, is something that I would call something like eternality or timelessness. So eternality or timelessness, or at least some kind of alteration of the time sense. So some sense of the timelessness or eternality of an image is an aspect of what makes it imaginal in our language, in our conception. And I've talked about this before in a few places, and for me it's a really important element. There's a difference between imaginal images have what I was calling an iconic nature versus a narrative nature. They don't go somewhere in time towards some grand resolution like a story, some heroic finale and redemption necessarily. The power and the redemption of the imaginal is not in its narrative apotheosis, it's not in its narrative kind of culmination or end point. So this to me is quite important. I call it iconic rather than narrative. Images tend to be iconic rather than narrative. So for example, take some, nowadays a lot of people are, very importantly drawing attention to the need, as hopefully humanity makes a transition or an evolution really of development of wisdom and practical wisdom into, let's say, 100% renewable energy. So important, coming away from fossil fuels and polluting fuels, and so the imagination, the faculty of the skillful imagination that human beings have is a very important faculty. Can we imagine that future when everyone is their homes are powered and energy comes and transport comes from 100% renewable energy, electric cars and whatnot. And can we imagine that, and imagine the stages that might move us towards that, that might transition us towards that state, and that there's no depletion of resources, minerals, etc., from the planet, species loss. Can we imagine that? It's a skillful use of the imagination. That's more of a narrative image. It's not yet imaginal. Imaginal has more of this timeless, kind of eternal quality. It's not moving in time necessarily towards some goal. Or if it is, because some images do have a kind of relatively narrative quality, it's what I tend to use with the word fantasy, but they have this aspect that they seem it's always already happening. This story, all the elements of the story, all the stages of this fantasy, of this narrative image, are actually somehow still happening, always happening in hierophanic time, and holy time, and sacred time. And somehow, curiously, the beginning is happening at the same time as the end of the story, even if they're, on the face of it, separated in time. So that there's still this timeless or eternal sense, whatever words we use to describe that, in an image, an imaginal image that is relatively that is of a relatively narrative nature. So what this means in practice, regarding to this element, is that we can pay attention when we're working with an image to the sense of temporality, the sense of temporality within and of that image, or that, if you like, imaginal perception, or the way we're sensing something, the soul. So we pay attention to the sense of temporality and notice it. Now this is often quite subtle, and it's as if the two levels go on at once, the sort of movement in time, of course, and the eternal aspect. But can we start tuning to the sense of temporality, and when we noticing the sense, attending and noticing the sense of temporality, and noticing and tuning to the, if you like, the sense of timelessness within the larger sense of temporality, the sense of eternality somehow pervading this image. And that, again, just as with the other elements, that noticing can amplify that very sense of eternality, which brings the whole thing, sort of raises up, if you like, or if you don't like that vertical innuendo, amplify or illuminate or bring alive that element of the imaginal, and then that element again spreads and the whole thing becomes imaginal. So there are many possibilities and flavors of time, and also of timelessness, when we sense with soul in the imaginal. It's not just one kind of experience we're talking about. There's many possibilities. So, for example, one may be dwelling with a sort of whole body, energy body awareness, and the sense of eternality of, if you like, of oneself as image, and of one's life as image, but in a certain way, meaning, in this case, just as an example, the sense of one's whole life with its narrative and its difficulties and its dukkha and its challenges and its tragedies and all of that, its story and the conditions of body, of soul, of story and conditions of relationship with others and world, and all of that kind of sensed or seen, so to speak, from, if you like, after death, from out of time, sub speciae aeternatis, meaning from the perspective of eternity, from the perspective of eternity. So what is it to get a sense of oneself and one's whole life, that whole stretch, birth to death, maybe even more, seen, if you like, from after death, from out of time. And that's one possibility. I'm just giving a possibility of a kind of eternality or timelessness. And one can sometimes actually find one's way into that perspective with the energy body, and if there's that energy body awareness and that eternality can open up the door to the imaginal, the doors, the gates to the imaginal, the gates to the mundus imaginalis. The imaginal world can open up just from seeing oneself. Oneself becomes image, one's life becomes icon, and becomes seen with soul, sensed with soul. And this will bring with it the other elements, the humility that we talked about, the fullness of intention that was talked about. It will ignite, illuminate, amplify, bring those into existence, and likewise those elements, for example, humility and the fullness of intention, will likewise help that sense of, in this case, beyond timeness or timelessness, this perspective of eternity, will help to ignite, illuminate, amplify, bring that into existence. And then one is sensing oneself, sensing one's life and one's death, and that whole journey with soul, as well as this moment now, as well and including the dukkha, all the dukkha, the whole life with the dukkha. And then, and that itself is extraordinarily beautiful and extraordinarily redeeming, healing, transforming, prayerful, mystical perception. Sensing all that with soul, and then at that point, there may be other possibilities that open up from that. One can relax that sort of whole life from the perspective of eternity, specie aeternatis. One can relax that whole perspective and emphasis a little bit, and then there's other aspects, or another relationship with time can be sensed with soul, other relationship with timelessness. So, for example, the unknown of the future and the moment can come and be sensed with soul. That very unknowing, we do not know our fate, we do not know the future. But when it's arrived at that way, opened up that way, with that kind of fullness and richness and dimensionality, that's quite different from just a kind of more flat acknowledgement or recognition of a very basic insight that we don't know the future, and one then, for the sake of equanimity, abides in a simple not knowing. Quite different, quite a different level of sensing and perception there. Now, someone maybe, let's say someone was hearing this and hadn't listened to all the other stuff, and they say, what are you saying? Are you saying this is something that's not impermanent? And for obviously for a Buddhist that would be a kind of either horrific heresy or just ridiculous or whatever. So I probably don't need to say this to you guys at this point, but of course images are impermanent. Of course everything is impermanent. Impermanence is obvious, and we're not at this, by introducing this aspect or element and drawing attention to it of eternality, of timelessness, we're not kind of dismissing the perspective that things are impermanent, that images, this very image that one is perhaps so moved by and senses as eternal, the very image is impermanent, it comes and goes. So we're somehow holding both at once, again. Yes, of course, it's obvious it's impermanent, and there's this timeless kind of strata or dimension or aspect to it. And sometimes, again, people with a lot of deep emptiness practice, if that's something that you've developed or just know that it's a possibility, one really can come to the point where one thoroughly and absolutely knows the emptiness of time alongside everything else. And that knowing of the emptiness of time kind of opens up and legitimizes a lot of possibilities in practice. A lot of possibilities. so we're kind of, as I said, holding the impermanence and the not so much permanence as timelessness, but you could say permanence, yeah, always already happening. We're holding them together. As William Blake said, help us or save us from single vision. Save us from single vision. It's just this, or it's just that, it's just eternal, it's just impermanent. There's this capacity in the imaginal to see with more than one way of looking at once, if you like. And there's nothing here that is being kind of presented or practiced because one can't face the truth of impermanence and the fact of death. There's completely nothing to do with that. So all this practice is grounded in, yes, death comes and we don't know when, usually. Everything dies, everyone dies, I will die, you will die. Everything is impermanent, and this, we do need to face up to that in life. We need to open the heart and the being to that. So it's not coming out of an inability or a refusal to face that kind of reality. And nor is it a kind of clinging to this sense of timelessness at the expense of a acknowledgement of impermanence. I hardly need to say this. It's not. We're not talking about here images of happy ever after, and so that will be what will happen, or an image that kind of ends all rosy with a happy ending or whatever. We're talking about something completely different. In what I just described about sensing the whole of one's existence with soul, there is still death, there is still suffering, and sometimes quite a difficult suffering that our life is afflicted by or given to handle, etc. It's not transmuting that into some other kind of ending. Yeah. So I know I don't need to say this. Okay. Number 18 is what I've been calling the imaginal middle way, or the middle way of the imaginal, or the theatre quality, the theatre aspect of the imaginal. This non-reification. It's not taken as real and literal and purely concretized, and the relationship with the real self in a real world, etc., is much more less solid, less fixated. So, someone might have, so I had an image or I had a vision of teaching or of serving or whatever it is, and traditional or rather maybe more usual kind of Dharma or spiritual approaches to that kind of thing, someone having those kind of images or visions of themselves teaching or serving or whatever it is, will let go of the attachment to whether that vision materializes and whether you get what you want, whether it comes to pass. So there's the teaching of, you had that image, but just let go of any attachment to that, to whether it materializes. Or it might be, again, in the more kind of usual or common approach, can you be aware and discern with that vision or that image of serving or whatever it is? Because it may be, if you like, true or accurate or kind of prophetic intuition, if you like, of something of the future or something that you're called to. Or it may be your delusion or your wishful thinking or whatever it is. But in either of those two kind of more common or usual spiritual approaches, they both rest on a kind of realist appropriation of the image or the vision. And they refer it to simply, to directly, to literally, and to concretely to a real self in a real world of real time. Yeah, so all the other elements that we talk about, the timelessness, and that's kind of not there, and it's all about a real possibility in a real self in a real world. And in neither case are those two either let go of the attachment to whether it materializes, or discern. Is that an intuitive glimpse of the future possibility, or is it just your kind of delusion there, and your wishful thinking? I mean, in neither case is the image treated imaginally. In neither case is it related to as or allowed to be an imaginal image in our sense of the word. Instead, it has to be categorized as either real or not real, either real or delusion. And the middle way, the imaginal, kind of is not content with either real or not real, either real or delusion, real or papancha. So this is what I mean by the middle way. Neither real nor not real seem adequate or accurate or truly appropriate kind of categories or labels for this imaginal perception, or this what I'm perceiving when I sense with soul. And another word I use here is the theatre element of it. So when we say theatre, that doesn't necessarily mean dramatic. Remember, I was giving examples of images that are really not dramatic at all, or even particularly narrative. They're just a sort of freeze frame of something. So the word theatre doesn't imply kind of grand drama or narrative, but it implies this kind of quality of or status of this figure, this perception has power for the soul, has a certain depth, a certain ability to affect and move me or us. It's important to me. It even feels necessary. It's soul-making comes with it. There's this infinite echoing, mirroring, all that. We talk about poetic truth or artistic truth. So that's another way of saying this. We're talking about something that's true, but it's a poetic truth. It's not a literal truth or necessarily a concrete truth. And so, like if I don't know if you've ever been, as I have, to a play in a theatre, and the theatre is very small, and one's sitting very near the actors, and the actors may be very good, and you. It's a very vulnerable, it's a very intimate, vulnerable experience to be in a good theatre with powerful actors in that way. It's very intimate. You are involved. You cannot not be involved unless you really go into some kind of shutdown mode. It's actually vulnerable for you as a member of the audience. You're right there. Open, your being is open. The actors can see you. Yeah, so all this relates to imaginal figures as well. And when we sense things with soul, which I'm using interchangeably, you can't be untouched in that situation, unimplicated. It's not the cold distance of the ideal scientific method. It's uninvolved. And so it's when we are practicing and something's imaginal, we can notice, it has this kind of theatre-like quality, in terms of it's not real because it's theatre, but it's not real either. And I don't just mean by not real. It's not real by the fact that it was just happening, so therefore something exists. I mean there's a deeper kind of poetic truth being communicated there. But this aspect, and again, it's something we can notice, and I am pretty sure that in time, anyone doing these imaginal practices and kind of getting into it will just notice that this is an element, this is an aspect of the imaginal, which again we may not notice at first. It may not be obvious to us at first. It has a quality of theatre, has an air of theatre to it. It's kind of neither real nor not real. Neither of those labels or categories really applies. It's in the imaginal middle way. Again, noticing that tenor of it, that status of it, that air or quality to it, amplifies that quality. It becomes more apparent. Over time, it becomes something that one can just notice immediately. With practice, and then again, the whole constellation can amplify, illuminate, evolve to the more authentically, fully imaginal. So that word play that I tend to use a lot in my teaching, whatever I'm teaching, Dharma-wise and practice-wise, is necessary or relevant, let's say, in both of its senses. We go to the theatre and we see a play. So there is something of a play happening, but something that has this artistic, poetic, necessary, vital, deep truth to it at the same time as it's theatre. Play, in the other sense, is necessary as well. The capacity and the permission for us to play in meditation and with perception and in life. Play with concepts, play with experiences, play with ways of looking, play with energies. Are we able and are we free? Are we granted permission to play? To me, that's absolutely necessary for it's the way I tend to teach. I think it's maybe not necessary, but really, really helpful for all practice. And in this realm of the imaginal and soul-making, I would say it's vital. Absolutely vital, necessary. So it's an ingredient, play, in both senses, an ingredient of imaginal practice. And it's an ingredient of soul-making that remains fertile and expanding. Something can be soul-making, then something freezes. We've been through all this on previous retreats when we talk about the soul-making dynamic and eros, psyche, logos, and all that. So we could say play, or the quality of play, the aspect of play, in both its senses is a prerequisite of soul-making and imaginal practice. So some practitioners have, deep desire. There's no doubt about their desire and their aspiration and their dedication to practice and the path. But that element of play is not so easy for them. Or for different reasons, possibly. It may be one of them, maybe they're actually, the capacity to play is inhibited by the very image or the logos, the psyche, or the logos of what practice looks like. And so I encounter this occasionally, but so important, I think, play in both its senses. And you just have to watch children playing to see how very serious that play can be. How captivating it is for them. And to me, it's something really, really beautiful. And they're not mistaking it for reality. If they're playing whatever it is, soldiers or, whatever, they're not mistaking that for a real world. It's like, I just shot you, bang, bang, you're dead, and now you get up. It's like, well, that doesn't make sense. There's no confusion there, just so with a play and playing and this imaginary way in the theatre. There's no confusion about kind of categories of reality. For the most part, we'll come back to this actually, but the play can be very serious, very engrossing, very vital and vitalizing and deeply important. And of course, we talk about playing music. see the play and the beauty and the necessity and the seriousness of, I know for me as a jazz musician when I was playing and all that. So sometimes what I've also noticed recently is sometimes people, and understand me, I don't think I've really touched on this so much, or not really made it transparent, the relationship of this imaginal middle way to the middle way of emptiness, and the more traditional middle way that the Buddha referred to in the Kaccayana Sutta in the Pali Canon, and then was really amplified by Nagarjuna and the whole Mahayana teachings. Middle way referring to emptiness between is and is not, exists and doesn't exist, real and not real. And so what's the relationship between that sort of traditional emptiness middle way and the imaginal middle way? They're not quite one and the same. I would say the emptiness middle way is, for me, is extremely important, but in terms of imaginal practice, it's more like understand that emptiness middle way is part of the much larger conceptual framework of the whole of practice and a certain range and directionality and range of directions of possibility of Dharma. In other words, understanding that deeply the middle way of emptiness is an integral part of a much larger logos and conceptual framework which we're trying to kind of unfold and explain and also in fact develop. So it has a kind of different place in the scheme of things, if you like. Not entirely, because for some people the emptiness middle way, when they really get a deep sense of that, that's the thing that for some people opens up the possibility of the imaginal as a viable and kind of sensible path, legitimized, and also opens up that sense of sacredness and the possibility of perceiving things imaginally with the imaginal middle way, in the imaginal middle way. So for some people, that's what is that understanding the emptiness middle way as a springboard, either in conceptually or in actual practice. The practice has actually arrived at that very deep sense of the emptiness middle way, and that's what opens up the imaginal middle way. Other people, and I wonder whether they're in the majority, other people don't need that deep sense of the middle way of emptiness in their practice. It's quite a deep level we're talking about, and they don't need that. It's more that they have a more a poet's sense of things, of poetic truth, of artistic truth. They have the sense, and they can feel it of the kind of theatre element. So it's just there in the perception. It's there integrated anyway into their life, into the way they live and consider things and relate to existence. Already this potential of the imaginal middle way, and as I said earlier, if it's not, it will emerge just as one gets familiar with the mundus imaginaris, with the imaginal realm and the perceptions there. One actually notices, like, oh yeah, there's that quality, and that distinguishes it, this imaginal middle way, from other perceptions. So for me, and I thought quite a lot about this when I was starting to teach this kind of thing, and was unsure whether to include it or not. But more and more I really lean towards wanting to include it in as a necessary part of soulmaking, a necessary part of what it means for something to be imaginal, and for something to be sensed with soul. I feel it's absolutely crucial, and not just for the philosophical sense and kind of framework that it gives, not just in the service of creating and establishing and opening up and filling out a kind of adequate and robust conceptual framework for the whole everything that we're doing here. That I think that's very important too. Actually, I think it's very, very important. But it's more crucial in the sense of this really helps the balance in regard to, especially when there's a lot of eros, especially when the soul is on fire that way, and there's all that beauty and all that attraction to this path and opening, and all kinds of things are opening up. It really helps this middle way, this sense of the middle way, the theatre element, really helps the navigation, the balance, and, as I say, the fertility. It helps in soul making. It's an element of any soul making. And I'm going to come back to this because it's actually not quite that simple. But let's just say that for now, and I would like to just emphasize just how important that is. Okay, so that was number 19, I think. Number 20 is of something we've actually already said, that the imaginal, or soul making, or sensing with soul, is in, like they say of beauty, it's in the eye of the beholder. Or we may say in the soul of the beholder, in the senses of the beholder. And that realization, that awareness, that recognition, that concept helps the imaginal middle way. When I realize, something is not objectively independently imaginal, whatever it is. We've went through this in this talk earlier, part 1, I think it was. But so realizing that, remembering it, recognizing it, and being aware of it, keeping in mind that concept, again, very, very lightly, it helps establish us, open us onto the middle way. In other words, it's soul making, sensing with soul, the realm of the imaginal, an imaginal figure or imaginal perception of something is in the eye, in the senses, in the soul of the beholder. Another way of saying that is, again, we said it before, is the imaginal is really a way of looking. And by way of looking, I mean that includes a way of conceiving, a way of relating. Yes? So nothing is, so to speak, objectively or independently imaginal. The imaginal arises as a dependent arising, dependent impart on the way of looking. Yeah? So that, as I said, that 20th aspect, as a concept, as an awareness, as a recognition, helps, for some people, helps in the establishing of that middle way, the imaginal middle way. Now, for some people, this talk or this teaching that perception, or actually any perception, whether it's imaginal or material, is dependent on the way of looking. This teaching that anything is dependent on the way of looking is tricky. When one hasn't quite seen it for oneself in practice through deep fading and all that, and the way things manifest dependent on the way of looking and what's wrapped up in the way of looking. And then it comes as a teaching, and I know I emphasize it over and over again, and for some people it's a little tricky, because the usual way of thinking and understanding can't help but conclude that if something is dependent on the way of looking, whether I sense something with soul, or I have this imaginal figure, or this beautiful perception of sacredness, and if it's dependent on the way of looking, then somehow it actually can't be real then, because our usual way of conceiving of reality is independent of the way of looking, having objective existence, and it can't be real, therefore it can't really have value, and it can't really be sacred. So this is troubling. It's and where, because I emphasize it so much, it can be a kind of a bit of a stumbling block for some people, and inclined to sort of do away with that element. So a couple of things about this. I would say that, again, a deeper understanding, journeying deeper into that whole experimenting and playing with and exploring ways of looking, and the whole notion of fabrication, that whole revelatory journey, beautiful revelatory journey. The deeper one goes, at a certain point, one really sees for oneself, one understands in one's bones the emptiness of everything. That means it's not that objects are dependent on way of looking, meaning that the self somehow, or the mind, or the awareness, or something here in the subject, or the way of looking, this is real, and it forms a real basis for what is not so real. We go deeper on this journey into understanding emptiness in practice. It has to be in practice, and we understand that everything is empty. Self is empty, subject is empty, awareness is empty, mind is empty, ways of looking are empty. They don't inherently exist. And what that does, because everything is empty and equally empty, if you like, then all becomes, rather than one thing is valuable, and in relation to that or relative to that, this thing is not valuable. This is sacred because it's real, and that is not sacred, not because it's not real, and therefore not valuable. Everything, because everything is equally, deeply, mysteriously, mystically empty. If one really goes into the roots of what emptiness means, or what we can sense of what emptiness means, and it is, that everything actually becomes sacred. Everything becomes valuable. Everything has this status of the, if you like, traditionally Buddhist middle way of being neither real nor not real. And there's a magic in that, in how it is and how things are, and they're appearing but being empty. So it rather opens up the door to more sacredness, more comprehensive sacredness, and more possibilities of kinds of sacredness. So I've talked and written about this before. I'm not going to go into it right now. What I want to emphasize right now is the 21st element of our list, which is the sense of participation. I'm emphasizing that because, in contrast to this kind of immature or not quite full understanding of a dependency of way of looking, which then reifies either the way of looking, or the subject, or the self, or the mind, or awareness that does the looking, does the sensing. The notion of participation, to me, it gives a sense of a dependency on the subject, on the way of looking, on the mind or awareness or self, but not without any objective pole or pole of value in the object, pole of sacredness or reality in the object. So this sense of participation is the 21st node or element. And I said, when I mentioned it in one of the earlier parts of this talk, the idea of participation, the notion of participation, it preserves autonomy in an understanding and a sense of non-separateness. Do you understand? So when something participates in some way in something, it's kind of got its own autonomy and kind of non-separate. And the kind of sense of participation we're talking about, the concept of it and the sense of it, meaning it's something sensible, we perceive it. I'm not just talking about an idea, just an idea, is a kind of a mystical one. So we might have a sense, for example, and a concept of participation in a divine archetype. So we're working with this imaginal figure, perceiving this imaginal figure, and there's a sense I'm somehow participating in the divinity that's so to speak, that I'm perceiving. I'm participating in an archetype. So the archetype actually needs my participation, and yet I kind of witness that archetype. I participate, or I can get a sense and a concept of participating in the mundus imaginalis. But again, it takes my participation. My participation is a part of it. It supports it, it feeds it, it nourishes it, it transforms it, it changes it. I am not separate from this mundus imaginalis, and yet it's not just a part of me, or reducible to me, or just a figment of my imagination, in the poor meaning of what that means. I can get a concept of participating in the always already happening in hierophanic time of whatever it is that I'm witnessing, participating in, a part of, partaking of, fabricating of the image. Get a sense, a concept of participating in the eros of the divine, or the divine eros. We talked about, traced that movement in the and that evolution of that kind of sense. Very particular, traced it in the Eros Unfettered talks. And one really gets a sense, a perception mixed with the concept of my eros is somehow I'm participating in some larger, deeper, more mysterious, more unfathomable, more divine eros. And similarly with the mind, that one's own mind, one's own insights, one's own perceptions, one's own conceiving, one's own holding of ideas and entertaining of ideas, and the arising of ideas, that one is also, one's mind is somehow participating in divine mind, in the Buddha nature, in the cosmic Buddha nature. One also can get a sense and a perception of participating in the intersubjectivity of the imaginal other, or the object, or the thing, person being sensed with soul. One participates in the intersubjective communication of eros flowing back and forth, and love flowing back and forth between the self and this other in soul making. One can again get a sense as all this deepens. And I would say, and the trajectory I traced in some of those talks in Eros Unfettered with all this is I would say it's a natural evolution. It's actually natural and inevitable evolution of the sense of things and the concept. If we're following this path, at some point, don't need to rush it or hurry it or whatever, but one can get a sense that this perception that I'm having right now, and this soul making that's happening right now, and then perhaps my whole life is and even the life of the culture and the history is a participation in the larger unfolding mystery of soul making. It's some larger unfolding of, again, the divine soul making. It's the soul making happening of the Buddha nature, and I and my soul making, all that involves, and all the elements and aspects and dimensions of my being that involves in that perception, in that conceiving, in that openness, in the body, all of it is participating in some much larger mystery of soul making that's unfolding. The Buddha nature soul making. The soul making of the cosmic Buddha, the soul making of the divine, the soul making of the God, whatever. So to me, when I get a sense of this, and I find it quite hard to convey, it's a deep and mysterious concept. You know, we're not talking just about, for example, when the food delivery truck pulls up at Gaia House on a whatever day it is, and go out and several coordinators help the work yogi, and the kitchen coordinators help them unload the food delivery and put it away. Once you say, "Oh, I participated in the unloading of the food delivery today at Gaia House," so that's a very sort of typically it would be quite a flat sort of unmysterious meaning of participate. I'm talking about something that includes that, but somehow more mysterious. As with many of the other facets and dimensions of the imaginal, this one may not be evident at first. It may be, but it may be one of those that's kind of like it emerges to our attention and consciousness. We notice it more after time, after we've kind of got more used to the imaginal realm and the perceptions there. We say, oh yeah, there's that quality. It's quite. It can be quite intense, the sense of participation, but it can be really, really subtle, really subtle. And there's a great variety in how sort of palpably and obviously it manifests. But I'm talking here about a deep and mysterious concept, a deep and mysterious sense of mystical participation in something. All right, number 22 is what we want to call, I think now, the concertina, the imaginal concertina, or the concertina of the imaginal. We used to, and I think one or two people picked up on it, I can't remember when, but we used to use the phrase vertical spectrum, or vertical spectrum of the imaginal, and I think we want to retract that. It was a little unfortunate choice. And replace that same concept, but really by the concept of concertina. You know what a concertina is? It's like an accordion that kind of opens like that. Or like what's it called? A bellows thing that you used to blow air on a fire. Something that kind of expands to reveal. Or like in those kind of old file cabinets, they kind of stretch open to expand to reveal all the individual files, or they can be kind of compact and you don't see all the files there. So again, there's probably a better word, but just for you to get a sense of what I mean by this. So when there's an imaginal image or a perception of something sensed with soul, it's also sensed to be in a context of possible other images. In other words, this way I'm seeing my beloved and sensing her, him, them imaginally, sensing them with soul, and it's like an image comes and it's sort of them and it's sort of not them, it's coming through them, it's a theophany. But there's also a sense at that point, and again sometimes this might be quite dim, sort of at the edges of our consciousness, of this is one image that I'm perceiving in a kind of context, in a larger context of other possible images. Because I could perceive her, sense her with soul, him, them with soul, and another image might kind of come to the fore, or replace this one, or be there at the same time, or be lingering in the background. So it's as if this concertina, I really mean, it's almost like there are other possibilities, other possible perceptions, so to speak, waiting in the wings. Again, like a theatre, like this character, this image is waiting for its time to come on stage. This actor is waiting. There's sort of a sense of other possibilities in potentia. Yes? Some of them, or sometimes some of these others can be clearly sensed or perceived even. They're kind of individually discernible, so that one is actually perceiving at times two images at the same time, and sometimes two images at the same time, along with the sort of regular perception of my beloved other, or this tree, or whatever it is that I'm sensing with soul. Other times, the sense of the concertina is more vague. It's more kind of implied, again, like a kind of pregnancy. There's sort of either the images there are vague, or they're just very dimly perceived, or we just have a sense of, the concertina is open. There is a concertina, but the individual images that are there are not certainly not coming to the fore, and also often not individually perceived. And maybe that's more the case sometimes, that it's just a sense of context. So we can notice, again, this might be a new element, and I'm not sure if I've talked about it before, but we can notice when that concertina expands, or it kind of like the concertina comes online, the context, or this range of possible images, or just the sense of a range of possible images, it kind of comes alive, or it comes online, so to speak. It's just expanded. And again, we can notice that concertina and tune to it, and that helps the whole sense become more imaginal. It helps the imaginal constellation become more filled out, more genuinely imaginal. So it might be, and with that allusion to waiting in the wings, it might be that this could be regarded, this element of concertina or aspect of concertina, the context, may be regarded as an aspect of the theatre element, or the middle way. And again, you can see as we go through this list how some are really, some elements are implicit in others, or kind of qualify others, as we said before. But in a way, this presence of the sense and the concept of a concertina or the context prevents us from kind of getting too narrow in our perception, getting too fixated. Again, to quote William Blake, it prevents us from collapsing our relationship and our perception and our conception into a kind of single vision. Because we're aware of the concertina, and that does something to the whole tenor, texture, ether, the realm, the air of the perception. So I hope that's clear. Okay, last one for now. Last one actually. Let's say for now. Concept. Okay, so concertina was 22. Concept. Concertina or context is 22. Concept is 23. And again, I mentioned this at the start when we rattled through the list. So imaginal perception, sensing with soul, is not non-conceptual. It's not a non-conceptual perception. One of my little quibbles by now is with just how freely and lazily I feel that notion of non-conceptual gets bandied about in some spiritual circles, in some Buddhist circles. I for myself, I don't mean by concept thinking. I've been through all this before, but I don't equate concept with thinking. Concept is a lot more subtle. You can have concept. You do have concept without actual, discursive thought, or heavy-duty kind of intellectual, big fat ideas, complex ideas. So I reserve the word non-conceptual, the category of non-conceptual, just for moments of the cessation of perception, just for moments when there is no fabrication and all perception is pacified, to borrow Nagarjuna's phrase. There's a fading of all perception, cessation of all perception and feeling, and that is a non-conceptual experience in my book, and only that really qualifies. And again, I've been written and talked about that. I'm not going to go into it too much right now, but for me, all and any perception has concept woven into it, and certainly any Dharma perception, if you like, or perception that arises in the context of Dharma practice, so including mindfulness. Mindfulness is not non-conceptual. So-called bare attention is not at all non-conceptual. there is always some sense, no matter how faint or subtle, of subject, object, and time as the basic sort of tripod of fabrication of very basic perceptions and conceptions. So wherever there's any perception of any kind of subject, any kind of object, any kind of time sense, or sense of the present moment even, or the present, there's concept involved. And actually in many of these practices, Dharma practices and regular sort of mainstream Dharma practices and mindfulness, there's all kinds of concepts woven in, all kinds. And in Imaginal and soul-making practices, sensing with soul, all kinds of concepts, a great range of concepts are brought in, or involved, let's say, an important part. So we mentioned the conception, or some kind of concept, no matter how vague it is, of the divine nature of this other that I'm perceiving, this imaginal figure, or this other that I'm sensing with soul. The divine nature and origin is a perception, is also a concept. We might also say that implicated in this concept, in this idea of concept as an important element of the imaginal conception, is we might say at least also the concept that's involved is not reductive. As I said, this image is a representation of some my compassion, or my something in my history, too tightly or narrowly or flatly conceived. So the conception has to be not too reductive or narrow that way. But things like this eternality or timelessness that we're talking about, that also is a conception. Always already happening is a conception as much as it is a perception. If we have an imaginal figure, could be anything, and they have certain qualities. So this warrior image that I sometimes shared, or warrior images, I think it was plural, that I shared some years ago. There's the conception, among many others, of their nobility and their courage and their dedication and devotion. These are all conceptions as much as they're perceptions. The whole conception and sense of an imaginal figure's autonomy and personhood, subjectivity, their soul, if you like, or them as souls, is also a concept as much as a sense. Love, as another element, is a concept, of course. It's also not only a concept, isn't it? It's a lot more than that, as are all these elements. They're not just concepts, but there is a conceptual element as part of any and all of this. What we were just referring to a little while ago about the participation of my mind in the divine mind. Participation of either the thinking, the conceiving, or the perceiving, or both. The participation of your mind in the divine mind. That's, again, a concept as much as it's a sense, an imaginal sense. There's something akin there. There's actually a long tradition of that kind of thinking, certainly in Western spirituality. I don't know if it started with Aristotle and his idea of the active intelligence. It might have been before that, and then it was modified and went through a kind of evolution. Lots of spiritual traditions, and Kabbalah and others draw on that and transform it and use it as quite a central kind of mystical principle in their conceptual frameworks. But we also get a sense of this kind of thing, the participation of mind in each other's minds, for instance, or in the divine mind. We get a sense of that, I think, in our life. We get a glimpse of it, a taste of it at different times. So, for example, when there's a kind of creative artistic flow, and and even if that's not necessarily something that happens instantaneously, like the I keep forgetting those Zen drawings what the word is for that you do very quickly, or a haiku that just comes really quick, or some phrase that comes when you're improvising music or something, and there's a sense in the moment of, wow, something just came through. But also in the longer stretches of sort of struggle with a big creative project over a long time, something might take 2 or 3 years to complete, whatever it is, writing a novel, writing a symphony, writing a book or whatever, and you can still get a sense of this creativity that's happening. It's me and it's not me. I'm participating in my struggle with this, my creativity, my application of mind in and through the creativity is a participation of my mind in something larger. Call it divine, whatever you want to call it. But also between each other, and I think I mentioned very briefly on a retreat once. So if sometimes like people sharing humor, that moment when you and someone else or a group of people, oftentimes it's well, who knows whether it's more common with two, there's a sense of like just grasping something together intuitively, and the spark, the flash of communication that happens there, the sort of brilliant intuition that happens, the connection that happens in finding something humorous or seeing what's humorous, and sometimes it would be very hard to actually articulate what it is. And there's something happens in the communication of that between human beings, but also with poetry and with language and with love and communicating love and sometimes non-verbally, all that. There's some way we kind of participate in some greater mind together, and that's how we can have these kind of intuitive flashes. We participating together in something, we kind of get it together in a brilliant moment of kind of revelation that defies any kind of mechanistic translation from one place to the other solely through certain flatly conceived materialistic means. So this kind of concept and sense is something that we can get a sense of in our life, I think, as well. But as I said earlier, when we're talking about participation as an idea, as a concept, as a notion, so participation in the divine is a concept, but I say it's very hard to articulate, very hard to define clearly, and perhaps that's partly what I meant when I said it was a mysterious and deep concept. Perhaps it defies such completely clear articulation. So, we could give another analogy for participation, something like the arm or the hand of a clock. Big Ben's big hand is part of the clock and participates in the clock's functioning. The clock needs that, to be a fully functioning clock. It needs, and yet it's not the clock. It's so it's participating, but that's much too gross and mechanistic analogy for the kind of sense that we can get of this kind of deeper, more mysterious participation when we practice more with the imaginal and with soul-making and with sensing the soul. And on that note, we can again draw attention to the fact that many of the concepts we use in this soul-making logos and conceptual frame, you'll notice, I don't know if it maybe irritates you or maybe you're thankful for it, but you'll notice that many of them are quite kind of vague as concepts, or if you like, open. So when we talked about today, when we talked about meaningfulness, and the suffix fullness is a leaving open. There's a kind of infinite possibility there. inexhaustible is a word we've used in the past. I can't kind of discern everything that's involved there. Similar with love, similar actually with the concept of soul. It's a kind of deliberately vague and open concept. And soul-making is also somewhat vague and somewhat very precisely defined and delineated, with all kinds of nuance and subtlety and qualifications and specificities and particularities and things to notice and things to include and things to exclude and blah blah blah. Blah. But actually, in another way, or at the same time, it's a kind of vague and open notion. And this relates to one of the elements on our list, this business of having soft and elastic edges. And I think I said at the time, not just imaginal figures, but also the concepts. The concepts that are part of soul-making and that actually lend themselves best to soul-making are ones that have, if they don't start with it, eventually they have, their edges get soft and elastic and stretchable. So there's this kind of vagueness and openness of concept on the one hand, of a lot of the concepts involved, and there's this birthing of delineations, as I said, subtle nuances and differences and discernments. There's this, and then on the other hand there's this, and it's slightly different than this. And the whole soul-making movement, the whole soul-making dynamic, because of what we've been through in describing in the way that Eros, Psyche, Logos work to fertilize, inseminate, complicate, expand, enrich, deepen and widen each other, there is the creation and discovery of more discernments, differentiations, delineations to make. So there is, at the same time as this kind of vagueness and openness, at the very same time there's an increasing kind of subtlety, both in conceptual terms, in terms of the logos and logoi involved, and in terms of the sensitivity of a being, in terms of what we can actually sense. There's delineations and discernments there. So again, you've got this kind of straddling, vagueness and openness on one side, precision and delineation and nuance and subtlety of discernment in all kinds of different ways on the other, because there is the ongoing creation, discovery of othernesses, other concepts, other aspects, other dimensions and sides and elements of things. But we, as I said at some point, I think it was in Eros Unfettered, we need a conceptual framework, and we need to use concepts in a way that serves what we're doing. And what we're doing is soul-making, what we're interested in and what we're devoted in this, for now, in this paradigm, in this stream of the teaching right now that I'm talking about. What we're interested in, what we're devoted to is soul-making, and therefore the way, the larger conceptual structure that we invoke and establish and present, and also the individual concepts need to serve that. And so they need to be both open and both loose, and also very refined, fine discrimination, subtle, sensitive discernments of the senses, the inner senses, the outer senses, and the thinking, the conceiving that's wrapped up in perceiving. And again, there's this straddling, this bridging, this including of the two. But we need, because it's exactly in that straddling that we will, or rather exactly that way of relating to and holding and conceiving of conceiving and concepts, it's exactly in that manner and that way that soul-making is supported. You understand? So if we're talking about classical scientific method, we want something different. You want kind of sharper concepts, or some social sciences, whatever. You want actually quite sharper concepts that are measurable and strictly definable, and either it is or it isn't. Either it's a 0 or a 1. Computers work that way. All that. If we're interested in soul-making, then our relationship with conceptuality, again, is not non-conceptual. We're deeply interested in conceiving, in logos, in the concepts we're entertaining. We develop flexibility with that. We develop richness and sophistication, and that comes alive to us as something beautiful, not non-conceptual. That whole, if you like, aspect of soul making, the logos aspect, starts to really come alive, if it's not already, and is an equally important and necessary and valid part, and vitalizing part of the whole soul making movement. So we're not going to be non-conceptual, but the way that we, the kinds of concepts and the way that they get born, and the way that they straddle this kind of vagueness and openness and softness and elasticity, vagueness, openness on one side, and refinement of delineation, discernment. That way of straddling is also very much part of the way we relate to, handle, and think of concepts. Yes. Okay, let's stop there for now.
Thank you for listening. To learn how you can support the teachers and Dharma Seed, please visit dharmaseed.org.